Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Kaveh Afrasiabi to the program today. Dr. Afrasiabi earned a PhD in political science from Boston University under the supervision of Howard Zinn, and has taught at the University of Tehran, the University of California, Berkeley, and Binghamton University. He is the author of numerous books, including Looking for Rights at Harvard, Iran's Nuclear Program Debating Facts versus Fiction, and After Khomeini, New Directions in Iran's Foreign Policy. He spoke with me from his home in Boston. Since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the U.S. has demonized Iran and its leaders and sought to overthrow its government. And it's typical with these efforts that one rationale after another is proposed to justify the demonization. But what, in your opinion, is the threat, if there is one, that Iran poses that causes leaders of both U.S. political parties to continue calling for regime change?
That is rehashing a familiar story with respect to Western superpower that dominated the Iranian political scene for decades of the historic revolution of 1979, which asserted the political independence of the Iranian nation. And in light of Iran's very sensitive geopolitical location straddled between two energy hubs in Caspian Sea and Persian Gulf, it was only natural for the new Iranian political system to adopt the counter-hegemonic posture that has sustained itself over the past 40 years. And so we have a clash of political wills between an intrusive Western superpower that for many decades turned the Persian Gulf into an American lake on the one hand, and on the other, the new post-revolutionary system that self-identified in terms of opposition to Western intrusive powers, and America in particular. The U.S. policy of seeking a rollback, which connects the various Democratic and Republican presidents since 1979, and I believe there's 7 of them so far, has been the common thread running through the circles of power in Washington, D.C., and its regional allies in Persian Gulf and Israel, of course. In a sense, we're dealing with the frozen context of hegemony and counter-hegemony and its various ebbs and flows and changing circumstances, which we have witnessed with, for example, the struggle over Syria, Syria being a strategic ally of Iran since 1980 and part of the so-called axis of resistance. And then in 2011, in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, it became subjected to these foreign meddlings trying to erode and neutralize Iran's influence in Syria and, inflict a mortal blow to axis of resistance, which did not succeed ultimately, partly as a result of Russia's intervention. But the struggle goes on, and have a new lineup of forces. For the foreseeable future, we can safely assume that this context of the conflict of interest between Iran and the U.S. will remain.
Well, you've written recently that Iran's foreign policy has advocated for a strong region, which I take it to mean one in which instability and tensions within and between nations in the Middle East is reduced. But you also note that there's a delicate connection between the U.S.'s confrontational Iran policy on the one hand, and on the other, Iran's counter strategy of survival through regionalism. So maybe you can talk about what you mean by Iranian regionalism and its connection with U.S. policy.
Well, first of all, it's important to note that Iran is not strictly speaking a merely Middle Eastern country. It's a multi-region nation that includes the Caspian Caucasus region. Central Asia is considered the backyard of Iran. Northwest Asia, and so Iran has multivarious regional identity that in turn assists it with its sanctions busting strategy. Since it's not an island to be easily blockaded, it takes advantage of its numerous neighbors and near neighbors, some 15 of them, in order to circumvent the U.S. sanctions and as part of its, strategy of resistance. So regionalism is very important because, in part, of the threat of terrorism led by ISIS recently that has spilled over inside Iran, and there have been some ISIS attacks even in the capital. And so the Iranian response has been that they need to redefine their national security well beyond their national borders because, of the threat of borderless terrorism that transcends national borders. Iran's intervention in Iraq to assist the Iraqis against ISIS as well as in Syria is interpreted as such in largely defensive measures. So in terms of the economic dimension of it, as we have seen with the recent Iraq visit of Iran's President Hassan Rouhani, Iran has been promoting inter-regional trade and good neighborly economic ties, turning Iraq into one of its larger trade partners, actually beneficial to both countries, seeking to address the sources of instability by promoting the idea of strong region that in turn implicates Iran in the idea of a cooperative security framework, emphasizing inward-looking security that does not rely on external forces. And of course, that runs counter to the logic of military dependency that dominates the Arab oil shipments of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, and others. There's a security bifurcation in the Persian Gulf between those countries that rely on the US and other Western powers for sustainment, and Iran, on the other hand, that seeks regionalism as an antidote for independency and for a strong region that is stable and prosperous.
I think the threat, what I've read too, is that some of the Gulf nations, see this as a threat or a part of the Sunni-Shia divide. Interpret Iran's regionalism as a desire to be the regional leader. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, there's of course, the other historic antipathy toward Persians, and Iranians, which is not necessarily synonymous with Shiism. It predates Islam and back to the Khamenei's and all the empire building that punctuates Iranian history. The Shia-Sunni fault line is real. In some ways, is perpetuated by both sides, some by design, some by default, some by force of circumstances. Because if you look at the horrific past few years of idol terrorism by ISIS, Western media hasn't really covered or done a decent job in covering the atrocities perpetrated against the Shiites by ISIS in Iraq and Syria. There have been many, many instances where, Shiite men and boys were slaughtered in mass, put in mass graves, some of them still being discovered, solely because of religious identity. Given the fact that Shiites constitute a rather small minority, 15% or so of the world's Muslims are Shiites, and you had these Sunni radical jihadists coming from over 70 countries around the world, fighting in Iraq and Syria to eradicate Shiites from the face of the earth. That was answered by, among other things, a fatwa, call for jihad by the Grand Ayatollah Sistani in Iraq, was complemented by the, timely assistance provided by Iran to the Iraqis as well as the Kurds fighting ISIS invasions. There is a strong Shiite bond today between Iranian and Iraqi Shiites and Alawites in Syria, principally because of its common enemy, which is Sunni radical jihadism, Wahhabism that was funded in some cases trained by Saudi Arabia and others. I'm not advocating the idea of Shiite crescent. Nonetheless, the fact of the matter is that we have a changing political situation in Iraq dominated by Sunnis since the country's founding until post 2003 invasion. And now you have a Shiite dominated polity in Iraq that acts increasingly in concert with Iran. Iran is under serious threat by the US power right now.
Right.
So that enlarges the threat of confrontation well beyond Iran's borders.
You're listening to Dr. Kaveh Afrasiabi, political scientist and author. And this is Wider View, a weekly conversation with analysts, authors, and activists rarely heard on the mainstream media. Wider View is made available free of charge to radio stations nationwide through the Pacifica Network, and the podcast of this show is available on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Play Music as Wider View Radio, and at widerviewradio.podbean.com. You wrote recently also that Trump's hostile Iran policy has actually strengthened the Islamic Republic politically, which I thought was a very interesting statement. Can you give me some examples of how Trump's policy is strengthening Iran politically?
In the mainstream U.S. media, particularly the right-wing media, there's a lot of hogwash about Iran's legitimacy crisis and how the system's mass basis and populist growth is eroding and it's ripe for picking, basically. Trump's approach toward Iran has been based on this premise, citing, mass protests and economic protests, etc., right?
Right.
With the onset of the new economic sanctions and US's withdrawal from the Iran nuclear accord, I think the table has been turned because it's safe to say that the vast majority of Iranians blame the US for the near demise of the Iran nuclear accord, which Iran has been in good faith implementing, and the economic hardship that has been leveled against the Iranian people. So compared to previously when the Rouhani government, had a harder time explaining, the economic shortfalls, now there is a legitimate explanation that blames the U.S. for a lot of these hardships, because if you look at, for example, the economic indicators prior to Trump's withdrawal from the Iranian nuclear accord, JCPOA. See that a lot of positive, not just from the Iranian sources, the IMF, the World Bank, were citing economic growth, lowering inflation, lowering unemployment rate, etc. And, a lot of foreign contracts that were signed producing jobs. And, Iran was on its way to a new leaf in the economic history. All that was reversed, unfortunately, wiped away as a result of the U.S. sanctions, which the Iranian people blame on the Trump administration. And he's the target of the hatred, not Ayatollah Khamenei or President Rouhani for the most part. So I think that instead of being weakened, economically, of course, Iran is weakened, but politically, I think there's a unity of will and purpose among the Iranian people to stand up to Uncle Sam. And it's another latest manifestation of oppression and injustice leveled against the Iranian people, which is a familiar history for Iranians. The system has picked up momentum and strengthened itself as a result.
It makes sense. One of the things I recently saw an article of yours about Mohammad Javad Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran, who recently resigned via Instagram to the shock of the diplomatic community. Yeah. And then President Rouhani refused to accept the resignation. Zarif remains at his post. And I saw recently a quote of him that he said his resignation was a nudge to bring the foreign ministry back to its rightful place. Can you tell us what the rightful place is that he's speaking of, and why did he feel a nudge was necessary?
Well, over the past few years, because of all the securitization of Iran's external relations in places such as Iraq, Syria, Persian Gulf as a whole, due to the threat of terrorism and instability, important aspects of Iran's foreign policy were divided between the foreign ministry and the security organs, such as the Revolutionary Guards. Its Quds branch, headed by General Soleimani, who in fact has been very forthcoming in one of his letters to an American general. He stated very adamantly that, he is in charge of Iran's Iraq policy, Syria, and so forth. And now that the conflict is pretty much over in these places, we're in a post-conflict situation, particularly in Iraq. It's important to give decision-making priority to the diplomatic channels rather than military intelligence.
Right.
And Zarif's recent trips to Iraq has highlighted that. So there was a bit of a disjunction or lack of fit that Zarif's minor jolt led to corrections in the system. And General Soleimani himself came out in support of Zarif and admitted that the foreign ministry is in charge of conducting Iran's foreign diplomacy, which is an important admission by him. So the system, in a dynamic situation, continues to adjust itself, and because of the passage to a post-conflict Iraq and hopefully Syria, Iranian diplomats will have greater leeway in conducting foreign policy toward its neighbors and beyond.
So lastly, I just wanted to ask you if you think it is possible to heal the rift between Iran and the United States after, 40 years now of hostility, and what would have to happen for that process to begin?
Well, very complicated and complex situation that involves the role and input of third parties. In our forthcoming book, we, draw attention to the very close relationship between the Trump administration and Saudi Arabia, which harbors its own hegemonic ambitions and this Pax Saudica, basically. with the Trump administration giving carte blanche to the Saudi rulers, turning a blind eye to their atrocities and the total lack of democracy and democratic rule and abuses of human rights, etc. Not to mention the calamitous war in Yemen that's gone on for so many years. So what needs to happen is for the U.S. to prioritize its own national interest instead of giving priority to the interests of other countries such as Israel and Saudi Arabia. Should that be the case, then there are areas of shared and parallel interests such as narco traffic from Afghanistan, stability in Afghanistan, as well as in Iraq, where both US and Iran basically support the same political forces.
Mm-hmm.
And then focus on those areas of agreement and use them as a ladder to enlarge the zones of agreement in order to address the areas of disagreement. I certainly don't prescribe to the notion that there's some diabolical animosity between the two countries, and some neocons or our poor institutions have recently penned a pamphlet or a book that says so much. But I think that's nonsense. And, there have been intelligence sharing and some cooperation against ISIS by Iran and US recently in Iraq, not so much in Syria. And I really think that, had the Trump administration implemented the JCPOA, there would have been a blossoming of US-Iran economic trade, because the absence of economic ties is really detrimental to the diplomatic connection. And so they need to cultivate economic relations as well and have ties of interdependence to overshadow political strategic differences.
Mm-hmm.
The two countries don't need to be in perfect harmony with each other to have diplomatic relations, and we've seen that with US and Russia and China and a lot of other countries, of course,
Mm-hmm.
But I think that the minimum necessary in order to advance the cause of the Trump and rapprochement right now is dreadfully missing because of this confrontational U.S. policy, which veers between rollback, containment, and this carte blanche for Pax Saudica. So it's not necessarily a regime change, because what happens the day after a regime change?
Right.
You just have to go back to the twin pillar strategy and accept Iran's claims in Persian Gulf, etc. I think U.S. wants to. It's a military-industrial complex has a vested interest in sowing division in Persian Gulf, selling billions of arms, and divide and conquer, which is the old neo-colonial strategy.
Right.
So as long as that dominates the U.S. foreign thinking, I'm not very optimistic about any significant changes in Iran-U.S. relations.
Right. Well, I would have to agree with you on that point, for sure. Well, good. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your taking the time with me today.
My pleasure.
You were listening to Dr. Kaveh Afrasiabi, political scientist and author, talking about Iran and U.S.-Iran relations. I really appreciate his being available to talk with me, and I was referred to him by Ramin Mazaheri, who was interviewed a few weeks ago. And Ramin is the Paris correspondent for Press TV, the Iranian state news network. And we have been following his reports on the Yellow Vest protests in Paris, and he put another one out just this weekend, so here it is.
For the 20th consecutive Saturday, Yellow Vest anti-government demonstrators turned out in huge numbers across the country, and despite increased state repression. Protests were banned across France for the second straight weekend, including on the Avenue Champs-Élysées in Paris. The mayor of Bordeaux ordered the metropolis to become a ghost town and commanded citizens to not leave their homes. But across the nation, Yellow Vests insisted on their right to freedom of assembly and defied the bans.
They have increased repression in order to scare people from joining our demonstrations. However, many of us will never be frightened and will never stop protesting. Macron has deployed the army against us, but we are not scared of them, and we are trying to persuade the police to join us.
Analysts say that the protests are not likely to subside until there is a major shift in economic policy. The base of the discontent is 8 years of accumulated austerity measures, as well as a major deficit of democracy as exposed by the government's refusal to heed public opinion.
I worked from the age of 14 until the age of 60, and in my entire life I accepted only 1 month of unemployment insurance. And yet, in the last 4 years, I have seen my pension lowered from 1,150 euros to 1,050 euros. My rent is 800 euros a month, so I cannot afford to live, and I will never accept this injustice.
The Macron era is turning into one of non-stop protests, economic stagnation, and record disapproval even from his own allies. 3 more ministers abandoned his cabinet this week, bringing the number of resignations to 10 in less than 2 years in office. The government's inability to pacify protesters means that every Saturday the entire nation is being forced to hold their breath and see how bad the violence will be. Yet again, the government resorted to mass searches, mass arrests, tear gas, rubber bullets, and police brutality against the Yellow Vests. Ramin Mazaheri, Press TV, Paris.
That's our program for this week. I want to take this opportunity to welcome those listening on KXCR 90.7 FM, non-commercial community radio for Florence and the Central Oregon coast. I hope you will listen each week at this time. If you have comments or questions about what you've heard, email me at widerviewradio@gmail.com or comment on our Facebook page at Widerview Radio. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening.